Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be hunted by something that shouldn't exist anymore? By warriors who were supposed to have vanished into history books decades before you were born? What would you do if the enemy you trained to fight wore gas masks and steel helmets, but the terror that stalked you in the darkness carried tomahawks and moved like shadows that remembered a land you thought was yours? Before we continue, I need your help. Comment below and tell me where you're watching this from. What state? What country? Because this channel depends on you to keep bringing these hidden stories to light. The truth has been buried for too long. Hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear has been suppressed by military archives for over a century. And we need your support to keep sharing what they don't want you to know. The official records from the spring of 1918 are incomplete, deliberately incomplete. The after-action reports from the 82nd Infantry Division training at Camp Pike in Arkansas contain gaps, entire weeks where nothing was supposedly recorded, as if those days simply didn't exist. But they did exist, and what happened during those missing weeks would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Those few who lived long enough to whisper about it in veterans' hospitals, their words dismissed as shell shock, despite never having left American soil. Lieutenant Marcus Weatherford arrived at Camp Pike on March 15, 1918, 3 days before the incident that military historians refuse to acknowledge. He came from Dallas, Texas, a second-generation officer whose father had served in the Indian Wars that officially ended in 1890. Marcus brought with him a company of 143 men, farm boys mostly, from Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arkansas, and Texas. They were being prepared for deployment to France, trained in trench warfare, gas mask drills, bayonet charges, standard procedure for that stage of the war. The camp sprawled across 15,000 acres of Arkansas wilderness, cleared land bordered by dense forests that local Quapaw elders had warned the army not to disturb. Those warnings, documented in the construction permits filed with the state, were ignored. The trees came down. The earth was leveled. Barracks rose where sacred burial grounds had stood untouched for centuries. On March 17th, a Sunday, the first soldier disappeared during a night patrol. Private Eugene Caldwell from Tulsa, 22 years old, engaged to be married. He was on perimeter duty, walking a route that took him along the western edge of the camp where the forest pressed closest to the cleared grounds. His rifle was found at 0300 hours, propped against a tree, fully loaded. His helmet lay 10 feet away, the chin strap cut clean through. Not torn, cut, with something sharp enough to slice through military-grade leather in a single stroke. There were tracks, not boot prints. The investigators noted in their initial report, later redacted, that the impressions in the mud were barefoot, narrow, leading into the forest. But that detail contradicts what the sentries reported seeing. They saw nothing, heard nothing. One moment, Private Caldwell was visible in the moonlight. The next moment, his post was empty. The search party found him 36 hours later, 8 miles into the forest, in a clearing that shouldn't have existed, according to any survey map of the area. He was alive, physically unharmed. Not a scratch on him. But Eugene Caldwell never spoke again. Not one word for the remaining 47 years of his life. He would sit in silence, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. And if you brought him paper and pencil, he would draw the same image over and over until his fingers bled. A circle of stones, a fire pit, and figures dancing around it, tall and thin, their bodies painted in designs that anthropologists later identified as Comanche war symbols, patterns that hadn't been used since the 1870s. Lieutenant Weatherford ordered increased patrols, double sentries, searchlights positioned to cover the forest perimeter. The men were uneasy, whispering among themselves. Many of them came from territories where grandparents still told stories about the Comanche raids, about entire families vanishing in the night, about the terror that came on horseback under the moon. But those were old stories, ancient history. The Comanche had been pacified, relocated to reservations in Oklahoma. That's what everyone believed. On March 19th, 3 more men disappeared. This time they were together, a machine gun crew maintaining their post on the southern perimeter. Corporals James Brennan from Amarillo, Robert Kingsley from Santa Fe, and Private First Class David Mora from San Antonio. The machine gun was found unmanned at dawn, ammunition belt still loaded, the weapon trained on the empty forest. But something had been left behind that wasn't there before. Hanging from the tripod, tied with sinew, was a length of bone. Human bone. A femur, the medical examiner later confirmed, from someone who had been dead for at least 50 years, possibly longer. Carved into the surface were symbols, pictographs that matched records from Comanche raids in the 1850s and 60s. And burned into the bone with incredible precision were coordinates, numbers that marked a location deep in the Ouachita Mountains, 140 miles northwest of the camp. The brass wanted it contained. They classified the incidents as desertions. The Army was preparing for the largest mobilization in American history. Training camps across the nation were processing thousands of men daily, and panic was the last thing they needed. But Lieutenant Weatherford couldn't classify it as desertion. Not when the 3 missing corporals were found the following week. They were returned. Not rescued. Returned. Delivered back to the camp perimeter in the pre-dawn hours of March 26th. The sentries on duty that night, 12 men positioned along the western fence line, all reported the same impossible story. The forest had been silent, normal, empty of movement. Then, suddenly, simultaneously, they all saw them. 3 figures standing just beyond the tree line, exactly where the cleared ground met the forest shadows. Privates Brennan, Kingsley, and Mora, standing at attention in perfect formation, still wearing their uniforms, eyes forward, absolutely motionless. The officer of the watch, Captain Gerald Hutchins from New Orleans, approached with a squad of armed men. He called out to the soldiers. They didn't respond, didn't move, didn't even blink. As the squad got closer, within 30 feet, they saw the details that the official report tried to suppress. All 3 men had been marked. Their faces were painted in ash and red clay, traditional Comanche war paint patterns. Their uniforms had been cut in specific places, ritualistic cuts that matched descriptions from 19th century captivity narratives. And their eyes, all 3 sets of eyes, were wrong. They were looking at us, Captain Hutchins wrote in his personal diary, recovered after his death in 1962. But they weren't seeing us. They were seeing something else, something that was using them to see us. I've been in combat. I've seen men die in terrible ways, but I've never felt fear like that. It was like standing in front of something that was ancient and hungry and patient. Something that had been waiting for us to come back to land we never should have taken. The 3 soldiers were brought into the camp medical facility. They remained catatonic, unresponsive to any stimulus. But they moved in perfect synchronization. When one breathed, the others breathed at the exact same moment. When one's eyes shifted, all 3 pairs of eyes moved together. The camp physician, Dr. Benjamin Strauss from Philadelphia, documented something that made him request an immediate transfer. At precisely midnight, all 3 men sat up simultaneously and spoke in a language none of them had known before. The camp's linguistic consultant, Professor William Ashford from the University of Oklahoma, identified it as Comanchero trade dialect, a pidgin language used in the mid-1800s for communication between Comanche warriors and Mexican traders. The words were recorded phonetically by a stenographer. Puha returns. The land remembers. The warriors are dreaming awake. You built your war lodge on our sacred earth. Now the dreamers walk between worlds, and they are teaching us how to cross back. After delivering that message, all three men fell back onto their cots and died simultaneously. The autopsies showed nothing. No wounds, no poison, no disease. Three healthy young men simply stopped living at the exact same instant, as if something had reached into their chests and switched off their hearts with surgical precision. The camp was locked down. No one in, no one out. The official story released to the press was an outbreak of Spanish influenza, which was plausible given the pandemic sweeping the nation that year. But the men at Camp Pike knew better. They knew what they were seeing in the forest at night: shadows that moved against the wind, figures that appeared and disappeared between the trees, always watching, always waiting. Lieutenant Weatherford made a decision that would end his military career. He took a volunteer squad, 15 men who understood they might not come back, and followed the coordinates that had been burned into that bone. They requisitioned trucks, weapons, supplies, and left the camp before dawn on April 2nd, heading northwest into the mountains, into territory that maps marked as uninhabited wilderness. The journey took 3 days, navigating logging roads that hadn't been maintained in decades, crossing streams swollen with spring melt, passing through valleys where the trees grew so thick that noon felt like twilight. They found settlements that weren't on any map, small clusters of houses where people watched them pass with hostile silence, communities that had been isolated for so long that they seemed to exist in a different time. On the evening of April 4th, they reached the coordinates, a canyon deep in the Ouachita Range, accessible only by a single narrow trail that horses would have struggled to navigate. The vehicles had to be left behind. The men continued on foot, following the canyon as it twisted deeper into the mountains, the walls rising higher on either side until the sky was just a thin strip of fading light far above them. They found the camp at dusk, not an abandoned camp, but one that looked recently used, impossibly recently used. Fire pits still warm, the ashes barely cold, hide shelters constructed in traditional Comanche style, the poles fresh cut, the buffalo skins supple and new, despite buffalo having been nearly extinct in that region since the 1870s. And everywhere, carved into the rocks, painted on the canyon walls, scratched into the earth itself, were symbols and pictographs that told a story no historian had ever documented. Private First Class Samuel Chen from San Francisco, the squad's surveyor and cartographer, photographed everything. Those photographs still exist in private collections, despite the Army's attempts to confiscate every copy. They show symbols that combine traditional Comanche religious iconography with something else, something that anthropologists and archaeologists have been unable to categorize. Spirals that seem to move when you look at them, figures that appear human in some images and decidedly not human in others. And dates, carved in a mixture of Comanche counting marks and Arabic numerals, suggesting a calendar system that tracked time differently than the Western linear model. The most disturbing photograph shows what Private Chen labeled as the teaching wall. A smooth section of canyon rock, 20 feet high and 30 feet wide, covered entirely in pictographs that formed a narrative sequence. The story they told was this. Centuries ago, long before Europeans arrived, the Comanche people made contact with something in these mountains, something they called the Puha, the spirit power that existed before humans walked the earth. The Puha taught them secrets, gave them power, but demanded payment, blood, and ritual. As long as the ceremonies were performed, as long as the sacred places remained undisturbed, the Puha would sleep and the Comanche would thrive. But the Indian Wars came. The Comanche were defeated, scattered, their sacred sites desecrated and built over, their ceremonies banned, their people forced onto reservations. And according to the pictographs, the Puha began to wake. Not all at once, but slowly, like something ancient stirring in a sleep that had lasted millennia. And as it woke, it reached out through the dreams of the surviving Comanche elders, teaching them how to remember, how to perform the old rituals in new ways, how to call across the barrier between the living world and whatever existed on the other side. The pictographs showed soldiers in modern uniforms, clearly depicting World War I-era American troops. They showed camps built on sacred ground, and they showed what the Puha would do through warriors who existed between death and dreaming, men who had died in the Indian Wars decades ago, but who could be called back, brought through, made physical again for just long enough to reclaim what had been taken. Sergeant William Foster from Austin, a veteran of the Philippine insurrection who had seen combat in guerrilla warfare, understood at first. "They're not raiding us," he said, his voice carrying in the canyon silence. "They're teaching us fear, showing us what it felt like when we did this to them. They're making us understand." That night, camped in the canyon with sentries posted and weapons ready, the squad experienced something that would leave 11 of the 15 men institutionalized for the rest of their lives. At exactly midnight, the temperature dropped 30 degrees in less than a minute. Their breath came out in white clouds, despite it being early April. And they heard the drums. Not recorded drums, not someone playing drums somewhere in the darkness. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, rhythmic and perfect, following patterns that seemed to bypass their ears and resonate directly in their chests, in their bones, in the primitive parts of their brains that remembered when humans were prey. And with the drums came voices, chanting in Comanche, words that none of the soldiers understood, but that filled them with an overwhelming sense of grief and rage and loss that wasn't theirs, that belonged to people who had been murdered and displaced and erased. Then they appeared, figures emerging from the darkness, dozens of them, warriors dressed in traditional Comanche war regalia, their bodies painted for battle, carrying weapons that gleamed in the starlight despite being made of stone and wood and bone. They formed a circle around the camp, standing motionless, watching with eyes that reflected the firelight like animals, like something that wasn't quite human anymore. Lieutenant Weatherford stood, slowly, hands raised to show he was unarmed. He spoke, his voice steady despite the terror that was threatening to crack his sanity. "We came to understand. We came to learn. We honor your sacred place. We mean no disrespect." One of the figures stepped forward, taller than the others, wearing a headdress of eagle feathers and bear claws, his face painted in black and red, his eyes ancient beyond measure. When he spoke, it was in perfect English, with an accent that belonged to no region, no time, no living tongue. "You build your war houses on the bones of our children. You train your young men to kill on ground where we prayed for peace. The Puha is awake now, and it remembers. It remembers every promise broken, every treaty torn, every life taken. And it has given us a gift. The gift of crossing back, of teaching you what terror truly means. Not the terror of bullets and trenches, but the terror of being hunted by something that cannot die, that will not stop, that knows your name and your bloodline, and will follow you through time itself." The figure raised his hand, and every weapon in the camp fired simultaneously, not at the warriors, but into the air, into the ground, into the night. The rifles emptied their magazines without a single soldier touching a trigger. The pistols discharged until their slides locked back, and when the echoes of gunfire faded, the warriors were gone, vanished as if they had never existed. But something had been left behind in the center of the camp. A medicine bundle wrapped in deer hide, tied with sinew, marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Private Chen photographed it before Lieutenant Weatherford could stop him. Inside the bundle, when they finally worked up the courage to open it, they found items that shouldn't have existed together. A sergeant's insignia from the 7th Cavalry, Custer's unit, stained with old blood. A pocket watch stopped at exactly 3:37. The back engraved with a name, Captain William Fetterman, who died at Fort Phil Kearny in 1866. Dog tags from soldiers who had gone missing at Camp Pike. And a letter, written in English on modern paper with modern ink, in perfect handwriting that looked printed rather than written. The letter said, "The sacred places remember. We have shown you our power, not to destroy you, but to warn you. Tell your chiefs to move the war lodge. Honor the ground you have violated. Or when your young men go across the ocean to fight in the white man's war, they will carry us with them. We will be in their dreams, in their trenches, in their minds when they face the enemy. And they will know that the terror you inflicted on us has followed them, that no distance is great enough to escape what you have awakened. This is not vengeance. This is justice. This is memory made flesh." Lieutenant Weatherford and his squad returned to Camp Pike on April 8th. They delivered their report, presented the evidence, turned over the photographs and the letter. Within 24 hours, they were all reassigned to different units, scattered across the country, forbidden from discussing what they had witnessed under threat of court-martial. The camp at the coordinates was investigated by a special Army intelligence unit, but their findings were immediately classified and remain sealed to this day in Archives Section 12 of the National Military Records Center in St. Louis, accessible only with executive-level clearance. Camp Pike continued operations, but the disappearances didn't stop. Between March and November of 1918, 47 soldiers vanished from the camp or returned in catatonic states from which they never recovered. The official explanation varied: desertions, influenza, training accidents. But the men who served there knew. They knew about the figures in the forest, about the drums that played on certain nights, about the dreams that all of them shared. Dreams of being hunted through endless darkness by warriors who had been dead for decades, but who moved with the patience and purpose of something that had all the time in the world. The War Department's response was swift and surgical. On November 11, 1918, the exact day the armistice was signed ending World War I, Camp Pike was redesignated and restructured. Units were rotated out, new commanders brought in, and a concentrated effort was made to erase any institutional memory of what had happened during those 8 months. But the men who had served there carried the knowledge with them, and when they shipped overseas to join the American Expeditionary Forces in France, something came with them. The official casualty reports from the 82nd Infantry Division show an anomaly that military historians have never adequately explained. Between November 1918 and the division's return home in May 1919, 43 men died not from enemy action, not from disease, not from accidents, but from what the medical reports classified as acute psychological collapse leading to cardiac arrest. They simply stopped living, their hearts giving out while they slept, their faces frozen in expressions that the attending physicians described as abject terror. But it was the dreams that connected them. Every single one of those 43 men, in the days before their deaths, reported the same nightmare to chaplains, to medical officers, to fellow soldiers who wrote about it in letters home. They dreamed of being hunted through trenches that weren't French trenches, through forests that weren't European forests, by warriors who wore gas masks decorated with war paint, who carried both tomahawks and Enfield rifles, who moved between the worlds of the living and the dead with absolute purpose. Private James Morrison from Little Rock, who had served at Camp Pike from March through August of 1918, wrote to his mother 3 days before his death in a field hospital near Verdun. "They followed us here, Mama, across the ocean, across the war, into our dreams. I see them when I close my eyes. The same warriors from the forest. But now they're teaching the French ghosts how to cross over too. This war killed so many so fast that the barrier between worlds is thin here. And they're using that thinness, showing other dead soldiers how to come back, how to haunt the living, how to make us understand what we did to them. I won't survive this, Mama. Not because of the Germans, but because I'm being called back. Called to answer for sins I didn't commit, but that I inherited. Tell everyone I love them. Tell them the sacred places matter. Tell them the dead remember." He died that night. The autopsy showed a healthy 24-year-old male with no underlying conditions, no wounds, no disease. He simply stopped breathing at exactly 3:37 in the morning, the same time marked on the pocket watch found in that medicine bundle in the Ouachita Mountains. Back in the United States, the pattern expanded. Veterans returning from Camp Pike began reporting incidents across Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, New Mexico, anywhere the 82nd had recruited from. They would wake in the middle of the night to find symbols painted on their bedroom walls in ash and clay, symbols that matched the pictographs from the canyon. They would hear drums in the distance, always at midnight, rhythmic and patient. Their children would wake screaming about visitors who came through the windows, tall men painted for war, who stood at the foot of their beds and just watched, studying them, learning their bloodlines. Dr. Evelyn Cartwright from the Oklahoma State Mental Hospital documented 78 cases between 1919 and 1923. Veterans who claimed they were being stalked by something that defied explanation. Her files, seized by federal authorities during a raid in 1924 and never returned, contained testimony that followed a consistent pattern. The men would first experience nightmares, then waking visions, then physical manifestations. Objects would move in their homes. Handprints would appear on windows from the outside, even on the third floor of buildings. And always, they would find items that shouldn't exist, artifacts from the Indian Wars, personal effects from soldiers who had died in conflicts with the Comanche decades earlier, left in their homes as gifts or warnings or both. The most disturbing case involved Sergeant Thomas Whitmore from Tulsa, who had been part of Lieutenant Weatherford's squad that went into the mountains. He returned home in 1919, married his childhood sweetheart, started a family, tried to live a normal life. But in 1922, his wife Sarah filed a police report claiming that their home was being invaded every night by intruders who left no trace. She described waking to find their 3-year-old daughter Emma standing at the window, talking to someone outside, having conversations in a language Sarah didn't recognize. When pressed, little Emma said she was talking to the painted uncles, that they were teaching her songs, that they were kind to her, but very sad because their children had been killed a long time ago, and they missed them. The police investigated, found nothing, attributed it to the trauma of her father's war service affecting the family. But then Emma began drawing pictures, dozens of pictures in crayon and pencil, images that no 3-year-old should have been able to create. They showed warriors on horseback, villages burning, soldiers shooting women and children, mass graves covered with dirt and lies. Dr. Cartwright examined the drawings and compared them to historical records of specific Comanche raids and counter-raids, specific massacres that occurred during the Indian Wars. Emma's drawings contained details that matched archival photographs and military reports from the 1860s and 70s, details that a child in Oklahoma in 1922 could not possibly have known, details that weren't even in history books because they had been suppressed by the government. Sergeant Whitmore took his daughter to a Comanche elder, Thomas Yellowbird, who lived on a reservation outside Lawton, Oklahoma. The meeting was documented in Yellowbird's personal journal, recovered by his great-grandson in 1986, and donated to the Smithsonian Institution, where it remains in their restricted access collections. According to Yellowbird, the moment he saw the child, he knew what was happening. "The dreamers have chosen her as a witness," he wrote. "The puha shows the young ones the truth, because children cannot lie to themselves the way adults do. They are making her remember what we were forced to forget, teaching her the history that was erased. This is not possession. This is education. The spirits are not trying to harm her. They are trying to save their memory through her. But the father is terrified because he knows what his people did, what his uniform represented, and he cannot bear to see the truth reflected in his daughter's eyes." Thomas Yellowbird performed a ceremony, not to banish the spirits, but to help the child understand and integrate what she was being shown. He taught her to ask questions, to communicate respectfully, to honor what the warriors were trying to share. And according to his journal, it worked. The nighttime visits continued, but they became peaceful exchanges, ancestral education rather than haunting. Emma Whitmore grew up to become a historian, specializing in Native American studies, publishing 3 books on the Comanche experience during the reservation era, work that fundamentally changed academic understanding of that period. But her father never recovered. Sergeant Whitmore committed suicide in 1929, leaving a note that simply said, "I saw what we did. I can't unsee it. The warriors showed me through their eyes, made me feel what they felt. I understand now. But understanding doesn't bring forgiveness. It only brings weight, and I can't carry it anymore." The connections expanded beyond individual veterans. Researchers began noticing patterns in the locations where these incidents occurred. They clustered around specific sites, places where military installations had been built on land that had significance to the Comanche people. Camp Pike in Arkansas, Fort Sill in Oklahoma, Fort Bliss in Texas, Fort Sumner in New Mexico. Every single base where soldiers reported these experiences had been constructed on or near sites that appeared in Comanche oral histories as sacred spaces, burial grounds, ceremonial locations. A young anthropologist named David Thornton from Yale University began investigating in 1925, interviewing veterans, visiting the sites, documenting the patterns. His preliminary research suggested that something profound had occurred during World War I, that the combination of industrial-scale death in Europe and the violation of sacred Native American sites in the United States had created what he called a spiritual feedback loop, where the trauma of war was amplifying and being amplified by older, deeper traumas that had never been resolved. Thornton's research was never published. He disappeared in March 1926 while conducting fieldwork in the Ouachita Mountains, specifically attempting to locate the canyon where Lieutenant Weatherford's squad had encountered the warriors. His camp was found intact, his notes and equipment undisturbed, but David Thornton was never seen again. Local search parties combed the area for weeks, finding nothing. Then, 6 months later, his camera was discovered by hikers, hanging from a tree branch 5 miles from where his camp had been, the film inside still intact. The photographs on that film were developed by the FBI, which had taken over the investigation after pressure from Thornton's family and Yale University. Those images have never been released to the public, but according to leaked reports from agents who viewed them, they showed Thornton in various locations throughout the canyon. But he wasn't alone. In each photograph, standing behind him, around him, watching him, were figures that shouldn't have registered on film. Translucent warriors that appeared to be there and not there simultaneously, existing in multiple exposures as if the camera was capturing them, moving between different states of reality. The final photograph on the roll showed Thornton facing the camera directly, his expression calm, almost peaceful. And written in the dirt at his feet, clearly visible, was a message in English. He chose to stay. He chose to learn. He chose to remember for those who refuse to remember. This is not abduction. This is initiation. The FBI closed the case as a missing person, presumed dead, but agents continued to monitor the area for years afterward. Reports from their surveillance, declassified in 1994 under the Freedom of Information Act, describe ongoing strange occurrences. Hikers reporting encounters with Native Americans dressed in traditional clothing who spoke perfect modern English but vanished when approached. Forest Service rangers finding ceremonial sites that appeared overnight and disappeared just as quickly. And always, the drums, heard by dozens of witnesses over decades, rhythmic and patient, coming from deep in the mountains where no living communities existed. The story should have ended there, another American mystery, another piece of unexplained history. But it didn't end. It evolved. In the 1940s, during World War II, the pattern repeated at military bases across the American Southwest. In the 1960s, during Vietnam, soldiers from Oklahoma and Texas units reported dreams identical to what the World War I veterans had experienced. And in the 2000s, troops deploying from Fort Sill and Fort Hood began posting online about encounters that matched the historical accounts with disturbing precision. A Marine Corps corporal from Dallas, posting anonymously on a veterans forum in 2006, described waking up in his barracks in Iraq to find symbols painted on the wall above his bunk. Traditional Comanche war symbols rendered in what looked like ash mixed with oil. His squad mates saw nothing. The symbols were invisible to everyone except him. But they were there, and they changed every night, telling a story he slowly learned to read. The story of cycles, of trauma echoing through generations, of debts that accumulate across time until they must be acknowledged or they will consume everyone involved. The question that remains unanswered is this: are the warriors real? Are they literal spirits of the dead, capable of crossing from whatever exists beyond death into our physical world? Or are they something else, manifestations of collective guilt, of historical trauma so profound that it takes on independent existence, that gains the power to haunt not just individuals, but entire cultures? Lieutenant Marcus Weatherford lived until 1968. He never spoke publicly about what happened at Camp Pike, honoring the order that had been given to him all those years before. But in his final weeks, dying of cancer in a veterans' hospital in San Antonio, he gave an interview to his grandson, a young Army lieutenant preparing for deployment to Vietnam. That interview was recorded on cassette tape, and copies exist in private collections, passed between people who study these phenomena, who believe there are layers to history that official records deliberately obscure. In the interview, his voice weak but clear, Marcus Weatherford said, "I've spent 50 years trying to understand what I saw in those mountains. I've read every book, talked to every elder who would speak with me, studied everything I could find about the Comanche people and their beliefs. And here's what I think. I think we did something terrible when we took this land. Not just killed people, though we did that. We killed the memory. We killed the stories. We killed the sacred connections between people and places that had existed for thousands of years. And when you kill something that profound, it doesn't just disappear. It transforms. It becomes something else, something angry and patient and determined to be remembered. Those warriors in the forest, in the canyon, in my dreams for 50 years, they're not trying to kill us. They're trying to teach us. They're trying to make us see what we refuse to see, understand what we refuse to understand. That land we built our camps on, that we trained our soldiers on, that we turned into weapons factories and military bases, that land is alive in ways we don't recognize. It remembers, and it will keep reminding us until we finally listen. He died 2 days after giving that interview at exactly 3:37 in the morning, the same time marked on every anomalous death connected to this phenomenon across 5 decades. His final words, whispered to the nurse who was with him, were documented in her report. "They're here, the painted ones. They've come to walk me across, and I'm grateful. Because now I finally get to understand." The camps still stand. Fort Pike, now called Little Rock Air Force Base. Fort Sill, still an active Army installation. Fort Bliss, Fort Hood, Fort Sumner, all of them operating, training new generations of soldiers, building weapons, preparing for wars. And the reports continue. Quieter now, more carefully documented, shared in whispers and encrypted messages rather than official channels. But they continue. The warriors are still there, still walking between worlds, still teaching those who will listen what it means to ignore history, what it costs to build your future on someone else's sacred ground. There are researchers, legitimate academics, and former military personnel who maintain that something genuine occurred during World War I, that the stress of industrial warfare combined with the desecration of Native American sacred sites created conditions that allowed something to cross over. They point to the consistency of the accounts, the documented physical evidence, the patterns that repeat across decades and different witnesses. They argue that we live in a world more complex than materialist science admits, that consciousness and history and trauma can interact in ways that produce real, measurable effects on physical reality. Others dismiss the entire phenomenon as collective hysteria, as the result of war trauma and cultural guilt manifesting as shared delusions. They explain the consistency of the accounts by pointing to common cultural touchstones, shared stories, and symbols that people unconsciously incorporate into their psychological breaks. But the sacred sites remain. The land remembers, whether we acknowledge its memory or not. And on certain nights, clear and cold, when the moon is right and the wind is still, people walking near those old bases, near those old forests, near those mountains in Arkansas and Oklahoma and Texas and New Mexico, they hear the drums, distant but clear, rhythmic and patient, playing a song that has been playing for generations and will continue playing until the debt is paid, until the memory is honored, until we finally understand that the only way to end the haunting is to acknowledge the truth of what caused it. This is not a story with a conclusion, because the events have not concluded. This is history in progress, trauma seeking resolution, justice demanding recognition. The warriors walk between worlds because we refuse to let them rest in either. We built our nation on their graves and then pretended those graves were empty, that the land was virgin territory, that nothing existed here before we arrived. But existence is stubborn, memory is persistent, and the dead, Especially the dead who were betrayed and murdered and erased, they have nothing but time. They can wait through decades, through centuries, if necessary. They can adapt to new technologies, new communication methods, new ways of reaching across the barrier between what was and what is. They can learn patience that outlasts empires. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all. Not that ghosts are real, though maybe they are. Not that the supernatural exists, though maybe it does. But that the consequences of our actions ripple forward through time in ways we cannot predict or control. That the choices we make about how we treat other human beings, how we honor or dishonor sacred spaces, how we remember or forget history, those choices echo forward into the future, affecting generations not yet born, creating debts that our children and grandchildren will have to pay. The warriors are still teaching. The question is whether we are finally ready to learn. In the end, whether you believe these accounts are literal truth or metaphorical warning, the message remains the same. The land holds memory. The dead demand recognition. And the sacred must be honored, not because of fear of punishment, but because that honor is what makes us fully human. When we lose the ability to respect what came before us, when we erase the stories that don't fit our preferred narrative, when we build our dreams on the nightmares we inflicted on others, we create a world that is fundamentally unstable, that will eventually turn on us and force us to confront everything we tried to bury. The drums are still playing in those mountains. Listen closely on quiet nights, and you might hear them. Not with your ears, perhaps, but with something deeper, that ancient part of human consciousness that knows when something old and true is trying to speak. And if you hear them, if you feel that rhythmic pulse calling across time and death and dimension, do not be afraid. Fear is what created this situation. Fear is what allowed the murders and the erasures and the lies. What is needed now is courage. The courage to remember. The courage to acknowledge. The courage to say, this happened. It was wrong. And we honor those who suffered by ensuring it never happens again. Only through that courage, only through that honest recognition of our shared and difficult history, can we finally give rest to the warriors who walk between worlds. Only then can we heal the land we wounded. Only then can we build a future that is not haunted by the crimes of our past. And only then, perhaps, will the drums finally fall silent. Not because they were defeated or driven away, but because their message was finally heard, their memory finally honored, their sacred places finally respected as they should have been respected from the very beginning. Turn to God. Turn to Jesus Christ. Because in the end, all of this, all of the suffering and the haunting and the endless cycles of trauma, it exists because we forgot the most fundamental teaching of faith, that all souls matter, that all lives are sacred, that the least among us, the conquered and the murdered and the forgotten, they are beloved by God just as much as the powerful and the victorious. When we honor the sacred in others, when we treat all human beings and all creation with the dignity and respect they deserve, we honor God. And when we desecrate and destroy and erase, we separate ourselves from divine grace. The warriors walk because we have not yet learned to walk in grace. The haunting continues because we have not yet learned to love as we were commanded to love. May we finally find the wisdom and the courage to break these cycles, to heal these wounds, to remember what we tried to forget. May we honor the dead by living with integrity. And may we finally, after all this time, all this suffering, learn to build our future on truth rather than on graves.